All right, my dear friends from the Beit Shalom Boulevard and from everywhere else in the nation who would be interested in listening to the Torah service, uh, I wish you Shabbat Shalom. That's the end of the Shabbat, and I'm gonna just quickly send the link to uh, uh, my friends who are trying to plug in so that we could start the Torah study live. I know you're looking forward to do this, and I'm gonna do it just quickly. Please pass the link around to those whose email I don't have at the moment. So there it is, and I hope you'll be able to hear me. Still fighting with different options because we had such a great opportunity when we were at BSB that I could just pull the TV screen and you could see myself and the Bible texts. Now I have to really use and read the text to you. But nevertheless, this is a good opportunity for us to study together. And so today's weekly Torah portion is called Vayakhel. Starts from Exodus 35, and because we don't have a leap year, we are going to have a double Torah portion at the end of the book of Exodus. So the two snippets from Vayakhel and the one snippet from the Vayakhel, and then we'll look at the Torah portion, which is called Pikudei. Uh, this is how what we see in Exodus 35. That's the beginning of Vayakhel. And Moses gathered all the congregation of the children of Israel together and said to them, these are words which the Lord has commanded you to do. Work shall be done for 6 days, but the seventh day shall be a holy day for you, a Sabbath, the rest of, of rest to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire on the Sabbath day. This is very interesting that we have again repetition of the Sabbath commandments. The reason for it is that when we look at the book of Exodus, we see starting from chapter 25 the plan of building the sanctuary. So from chapter 25 all the way through chapter 30, it's going to be all the description of all the details how the sanctuary is to be built. And then we have Exodus 31, which we read last Shabbat, where it says, okay, everything is fine. Wait a minute. But now just don't forget the Sabbath. So then we have a story right after that, unfortunate story of the golden calf. And we have an interruption until all this description of how Moses takes care of the golden calf and restores the relationship between God and the congregation of the sons of Israel. And then what we have starting from chapter 35 is the description of actual process of building the sanctuary, which is spearheaded by Bezalel. And this particular section is again capitalized by the commandment to keep Shabbat. Whoever does any work shall be put to death. So it's kind of a remember that's basically and for some of you, what we talked last time was it's kind of a repetition, but this is another point where you have this discussion of the Sabbath. I mean, of the beginning of the work on building a sanctuary, which precedes by the commandment of the Sabbath, and that's why the rabbis are making this decision that how do they define the work. And the work, first of all, like 39 basic works, they're derived from these chapters because these are mainly the works they were doing during the construction of the sanctuary, which I think is a smart way of determining what it means, any work. Okay, but then we have some additional statement here. Verse 3, you shall kindle no fire throughout your dwellings on Sabbath day. That's kind of an interesting statement here. And what actually does this mean? The issue back then was back in the old days of the Middle Ages and ancient time, it was pretty clear. We have periodically some examples of what you're not supposed to do on Shabbat, such as in Exodus chapter 16, when the question of manna arises. Now, then it says here very clear, Exodus 16:23. It says here, this is what the Lord said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Shabbat to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today. Boil what you will boil. Lay up for yourself. All that remains must be kept until the morning. So basically, this is a very clear statement against cooking on Sabbath. Baking, boiling, things like this. That's pretty straightforward. But here, there's another pretty clear prohibition about the Sabbath, which is you shall kindle no fire. Of course, if you don't bake, don't boil, and forget about your microwaves for a second, forget about your convection ovens for a second, forget about all your amenities. Imagine yourself in your ancestors' home, like I really love this story about Little House in the Prairie, which Jacob is reading. We were reading once. It's very interesting how the pioneers, explorers who went all the way to the west and just put the stakes and built this log house. They lived a simple life. I mean, they had, they built a stove and they needed a fire for the stove. So it's very simple. You have your Friday night. If it's winter, you start your stove in such a way that it would be kept. You put enough fuel to it, and you make your house warm. You have all your cooking, baking done, and you are not doing any work. Your fire is already there. If you need to kind of put an extra log, this is fine because your fire is there. Okay, you don't start the fire on Sabbath. You don't start heating your house on Sabbath. You start doing it in advance. It has to be there, and you just keep feeding into it. And the same way, actually, it's very interesting because we do the lighting of the candles, and I always thought about the special day, the Sabbath, how the Sabbath candles really demarcate the time boundary, and so this is how uh, we perceive the Sabbath candles, but uh, it's true that only on Shabbat, back in the first century, people would light uh, any lights at the house because it was so expensive with the oil lamps. But further into the Middle Ages, um, the tradition became to light the candles because that's going to be the light throughout the day, and you don't put it out. So this was pretty much simple when we deal with the fire. Cooking, fire, you cook in advance, you leave the light in advance, you leave the fire in advance so that you don't deal with this. Well, what do we do today? Well, today we're much more advanced, and we don't have to actually light or kindle the fire. Uh, so, what can this commandment be concerned of? If you look at what we do in the in our lives, I would probably see a certain limitation to like uh, making a barbecue on Sabbath, probably in both reasons, cooking and having the fire. So barbecuing, camping with a campfire on Sabbath, probably not the good idea. You just uh, don't have this kind of entertainment on Sabbath. You started on Sunday, whatever, and this should be pretty straightforward. Um, Judaism looks at this um, in a little different ways, and this is the reason why. Because 19th century was a very, very interesting time, and it's a very determining time for human history and for prophecy, by the way, because most of the prophecies of apocalyptic prophecies of Daniel point to the end of 18th, 19th century. And for that reason, there is a reason for it, because first of all, 19th century is the century of a huge progress. Famous physicist Michael Faraday has invented electric generation. Thomas Edison picked up on this and found out that if you put electric current through the wolfram little string, and you got to put it inside the nice glass casing with no air inside, with vacuum inside, that will create a light which is much cheaper and much greater than, for example, a kerosene lamp or whale oil lamp. And so this was a huge revolution. But this is the world, and this is the example of this. It's a scientific technology progress, but we also have another revolution, which is ideological revolution. And the ideological revolution starts with the beginning of the 18th century with Age of Enlightenment. The French philosophers, encyclopedists such as Voltaire, René Descartes, Denis Diderot, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, all these people who basically created the foundations of what we know today as a modern science. They also created the ideology of how do I say it, of atheism. So we don't need God. Descartes argued, I think this is why I exist. So my reasoning is enough to explain everything. I mean, all this, the Enlightenment age, this what's led to secularization, and secularization ended, with the Great French Revolution and the old, the whole Europe turns upside down. And this is way totally different than with English Revolution, where you still have a very religious people discussing the role of the king. Here is forget about the king, forget about God, we're all different. And then we have another idea, freedom, equality, and brotherhood. That's the French Revolution. But how does it affect what we study? What's the connection between the Torah commandment of kindling the fire on Sabbath day and the French Revolution? A very simple one. French Revolution liberated Jews. In which way? For 1500 years minimum in Western Europe, a Jew was not a person. In other words, as every American, you proudly hold your ID, right? So the ID identifies you as the person, and you have your individual social security number, which is uniquely yours. And if you happen to pass away, is not gonna, nobody's gonna get it. It's yours. This makes you unique forever. Individual. Not, Jews were not individuals back in the Western Europe. Jews were part of kahal, or congregation. It's very interesting. We're talking about, because here is the Torah portion, which is called Vayakhel, gathered the congregation. So when Jews settled in different cities of Western Europe, they would be treated as one congregation. What it means is that the congregation would have a representative, the leader of the congregation. Now it's called the president of Jewish community. But back then, the leader of the congregation was the only person who represented the collective body. Jew had to do what the congregation does. Jew had to, they had to literally walk in the locksteps, because if a Jew is expelled from his community, his congregation, this is a serious problem. And even today, Orthodox Jews are trying to maintain, even though most of all of them have now full American citizens, their children are citizens, they all have their IDs and so forth, but they maintain this status of one single community with the heads of the community representing and responsible for all the decisions made in the community, which the head of the Jewish congregation in a particular town on Western Europe in the Middle Ages carried tremendous responsibilities. He could be easily killed if a king or a duke didn't like Jews, but he also exercised tremendous power over his individual congregants, because they couldn't exist without a congregation. So many laws that Orthodox Jews have today, they were created in the Middle Ages under these type of conditions. A typical law is the law about the motherhood. Your motherhood determines your Jewishness. If your mother is Jewish, you're Jewish. But it was very medieval law. Why was it created? Actually, it was created with a good intent to protect rape victims. Because, again, a Jew is not a person. So a Jew cannot go to police, to court of the country which a Jew is, and ask for protection. It means if someone decided to rape a Jewish girl, she is absolutely defenseless. And what is she going to do when she comes back? Well, rabbis realized this, and that's why they came, all right, you have a child, we'll take care of this child. That was the way to protect Jewish women. There are other laws. For example, some Orthodox communities still have. If you go to New York, you'll see many, many Orthodox Jewish women, and you can recognize these Orthodox Jewish women just because they're wearing wigs. But they wear wigs because when they are getting married, they shave their heads. They shave their heads because of the medieval law. Medieval law, again, it was a rape protection, because a nobleman on whose territory this town was actually had a right to every one wedding. If he has a serfs or Jews, he had a right to the first night. So they just would shave the head of a girl before she gets married, so that she wouldn't be attractive to a lord of that particular land. So these were the circumstances under which medieval Jewish community had to survive for centuries. But then French Revolution finished all of these injustices. Freedom, equality, brotherhood. A Jew, doesn't matter. You want to live here? Yeah, you can rent anywhere. Oh, here's your ID. You're a citizen of France. You're now a citizen of Germany. Oh, you want to go to the university? Yeah, you can go. And the Jews like this. Wow. So many young men, Jewish men, went to the university. And what happened? They began to question the old century long laws. Why do we need them? Well, this is the birth of Reform Judaism. The more it developed in Germany, the more laws are being questioned, starting from the laws of the Ghetto, with the laws of the earlier rabbis, with the laws of the Torah. And so, very interesting story about my Hebrew Union College that I've graduated from. When they inaugurated the college, they had all the rabbis across the country come as an honored guest. They had services, and then they had the reception. And during the reception, they served shrimp salad. A number of Orthodox rabbis could not bear it. They stood up, they spit, and they left. And so this is considered one of the events, 1872, which you can make it as the split between Orthodoxy and progressive Judaism. And so this is where progressive Judaism is going. And, the more they go, the more they're laxed. Today, I remember attending in Cincinnati a conservative synagogue on Friday night where my friend was going, and she was a librarian with her husband and two kids, and they were members of this congregation. And I asked them Friday night if they're gonna come in the morning. I said, "No, we're not gonna come in the morning." I said, "Why? What are you doing in the morning?" "Oh, I have too many house chairs. I need to vacuum my house." So this is a typical American Judaism with very lax attitude. Very interesting. Sorry. A very interesting story about which happened lately at the meeting of yearly conference of Society of Biblical Literature. An Orthodox Jewish scholar walked through the exhibit hall, which was on Shabbat. And he walked by the booth, which sold an exhibit hall. They sell books. Of course, there are university presses, all kinds of things. So they sell books. So he walks by. It's nothing which is regular so far. But he walks by this booth, which is written Jewish Publications Society. I have quite a few books from Jewish Publications Society, and they sell books. So this rabbi lashes out at them and say, "What in the world are you doing?" And they say, "Get out of here. We're Reform. We don't care." It's interesting that few steps he made very angry, and he ran into another booth which was closed, and it was written, "Closed in honor of God's Sabbath, Andrews University Press." And so this is quite indicative and demonstrative about American Reform Judaism today, very typical. Orthodoxy in the 19th century saw a huge threat in secularization of Jews. And what did they decide to do? They decided to basically have the opposite direction. So the Orthodox rabbis assembled together, mainly Austro-Hungarian rabbis, and they came into conclusion any progress is against the Torah. They really developed orthodoxy. So today in Israel and in New York, many rules and regulation, they're no more than 200 years old because many of them were really instituted in the 19th century, especially when it comes about Sabbath and what do you think? Flipping the switch. Well, what's the problem? Very simple. What they do here, and it's very typical, the same way you look at Exodus 35, we already looked at very similar language, and it says, anyone who does any work, malacha. So, of course, we have to define malacha. So the same approach is here to the fire. You shall kindle no fire. So what is the fire? What they begin to think is this. Is this new uh, invention by Michael Faraday, which was really elevated to a new status by Thomas Edison, what is happening inside electric lamp? They just called it a fire. Since they called this a fire, now they say, all right, we can't flip switches. So I keep hearing story after story after story, which my Adventist friends tell about their Jewish neighbors, such as, for example, Chicago. And Chicago, their Chicago friends, they're basically, my Chicago friends told me this story how an Orthodox Jewish woman from upstairs apartment knocks on a hot Sabbath afternoon to their door and asks, could you please come up and turn on my air condition? Because we're not allowed to do this on Sabbath. Well, this is where it leads to. So, in other words, it's kind of an interesting situation that a similar story. In Jerusalem, some of you might have experienced with me, big tall building where our hotel was. We had two elevators. One elevator was regular, one was a Sabbath elevator. The Sabbath elevator, you do not press the button. It goes by itself. You just sit on it and wait until it reaches your floor. Goes floor after floor after floor. Itself opens the door, closes the door. You don't have to call it by button. It will come to you. So if you happen to be on a sixth floor and you need to go downstairs to the lobby and your elevator is going up, you'll make all the way up to the 18th floor and down to the lobby. It'll take you maybe nice 25 minutes. So no matter what you do, you can press the button. It's not gonna respond because it's a Sabbath elevator. And all of it is because of a definition that electricity is the fire, which is actually very arbitrary. And I honestly would argue against this based on my knowledge in physics. Because fire, of course, it produces light and heat, but it's a chemical reaction of a substance with oxygen. And what you have inside the fire is a hot gases. It's a plasma of hot gases. This is a chemical process by which a substance connects with oxygen. A result of it, you got smoke, you got ashes and stuff like this. Uh, Electricity is totally different physical process. It's nothing to do with chemistry. Electricity may originate with chemistry, but not with fire. But you have a generator that produces electromagnetic, that is interacts with electrical and magnetic fields, and you have electrons in the conductor, and they begin to travel inside the conductor from one end of the cord to another end of the cord, and this creates voltage and current. And if you have something like a wolfram spiral, which has quite a large ohmage, meaning electric resistance, it is going to generate a lot of heat and light because of the electric resistance. And if you have just a simple copper, which is a very good conductor, then the electric current is going to go through it, and you will have lots of a bigger amperage and lesser voltage. So these are totally different processes, and to say that that movement of electrons in the inside the metal is the fire, I would not agree with this. But what can I do? I can't debate with the large assembly of rabbis. So it is now a consensus that anything with electricity is the fire. So any action, flipping the switch, pushing the button, opening your phone, using your computer, anything of this nature is a violation of Exodus 35, verse 3. And that is what you do. You're kindling the fire. In that's the reason why we have so many restrictions for the Orthodox Jews today in New York and in Israel and in other areas that are dense, that where we have actually an organized Jewish community present. So what do we do with this? I have to tell you that Sabbath commandment, because of these issues, was ridiculed by Christians big time, because rabbis all the time attempted to actually determine what the work is and so forth. And when we talk about the 2nd century, we are talking about different leaders, new generation of leaders coming into Christianity. These generations are not your Jewish boys that grew up with their traditional Jewish parents. These are very well educated graduates of philosophical school who accepted Jesus, and now they're part of the church, and now they're leading the church, and unfortunately in the wrong direction. We have people like Origen, whose actually mother was Jewish, but the father was a noble Greek man in Alexandria. And he, of course, even though the family was Christian, father wanted his son to study in the philosophical school. So Origen had a privilege to study the best Neoplatonic philosophy, study the best philosophers, and was a classmate with the father of Neoplatonic philosophy, which became extremely popular in the second, third, fourth, fifth century. Father of Neoplatonic philosophy, Plotinus. And so, of course, this was reflected on his uh, understanding of Christianity. And so, in his works, Origen seriously ridiculed Jews for keeping the Torah. Why? Because Jews were very, very literalistic all the time. What does it mean, Malaka? What does it mean, Avada? Let's make a concrete, specific legal framework so that we would know what's violation, what's not. Origen is way the opposite. In his mind, because he studied Platonic philosophy, everything is allegory. Sabbath itself is allegory. Nothing matters. It's all symbols, it's all out there. And so he literally criticized and ridicules. And so now uh, his heritage still lives. Many evangelical Protestant Christians ridicule any idea of Sabbath keeping for Christians, saying, oh, this is so Jewish, this is so legalistic. And unfortunately, many Adventists preachers are buying into this, and they're trying to fight this legalism, and what you end up having is sometimes a bit messy. I don't know. It was a pretty interesting shock for the missionaries who came to on a mission trip to a school to help build school in one island, and after the divine service on Sabbath, the cooks went out and started cooking dinner. This is unfortunately the problem, because you know we're not balanced. We're now pressed by this attempts to fight legalism, and so looks like on Shabbat everything goes. But where do we find this balance? I believe we find this balance in Jesus. At least for me, he is an example. And I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that Jesus was observing Sabbath. According to Luke chapter 4, it says here in verse 16, he came to Nazareth, where he has been brought up, and as his custom, he went into the synagogue on Sabbath day. So it wasn't because he respected Jewish tradition, it was because he had custom. So he grew up with this, he continued to live by this, and this is pretty clear. His understanding of Sabbath was never changed. He didn't teach, it would be really, really stupid in these days to imagine somebody coming and says, well, yeah, we need to keep a day of rest. It doesn't matter what day of rest it is. It's a very simple question that you will be asked. Are you Jew or a pagan? Very simple. If you are a Jew, you do like the Jews do. If you want to have any day of rest, you don't belong to Israel. Very simple. So that's very simple here. And that's why His disciples, and again, this is Luke, and Luke, what is interesting for me in the gospel, what is interesting to me in the gospel of Luke is that he explains things in Greek language to those who are not Jews. That's why he's very meticulously describing all the customs of Jesus's childhood, his circumcision and so forth, describing Jesus growing up as a regular Jewish boy. So when you get to Luke chapter 23, describing the death of Jesus, so then we have this story that you have Joseph of Arimathea, who offered his family tomb for Jesus's body. And so he took, it says in verse 33, the body of Jesus, wrapped it in linen, and laid it in a tomb that was hewn out of the rock where no one had laid before. That day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew near. Now, a reaction of the women. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed after as they observed the tomb and how the body was laid. Well, we have to understand one thing in the old ancient burial uh, customs. They didn't have cemeteries. They had all these caves where they would put the body, but this body in the cave was laying temporarily for 1 year until the body decomposes, and then the bones are left. The bones are then they come into the tomb, and they collect the bones into one pile and put them in a small ossuary, a box. It's called ossuary, and they keep it in caves, and you can put many ossuaries in one cave and so forth. So the body had to be prepared properly, because what they don't want to happen is for animals to come and tear the body apart. And so they had to kind of put fragrances and stuff like this. But they didn't do it. They returned, prepared fragrance, spices, and fragrant oil, and they rested on Sabbath according to the commandment. So here what we see, even though Jesus was dead, his disciples clearly understood what they were supposed to do on Sabbath, on what they were not supposed to do on Sabbath. So they understood that the body will lay in the tomb for 24 plus hours, and then they'll come on Sunday morning and they'll finish the proper burial job. So they just, before the Sabbath, as you can see, the minimal job was done, and then the rest of the job that was supposed to wait, they didn't, they didn't do all of it. Oh, our teacher died, who cares, and so forth. See, this is important example from the Gospels, how disciples of Jesus treated the Sabbath and what they considered to be a work. And even though they wanted to give goodbye to their teacher, they wanted to give the last honors to their teacher, but some of it was the work, and they stopped. And they stopped. So this is a very good ethical example. Well, there is another interesting statement here, also in Luke, and it's repeated in Matthew, but it's Jesus's prediction of what's going to happen when Jerusalem will be surrounded by enemies. And so here, what he's Jesus predicting the destruction of the second temple, and he says to his uh, and he says to his disciples that they have to flee. And so it says, when you know that its desolation is near, Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and so forth. Then in Matthew chapter 24, we have a parallel description with more details. And these are the words of Jesus. And here, what he says specifically, what should those who follow him pray about? Pray, verse 20, that your flight might not be in winter or on Sabbath. In other words, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you don't linger. You have to rush. You have to run away. Just pray that it wouldn't be on Sabbath, which implies on Sabbath, you usually don't do these long travels. And this is very important. Unless it's an emergency, you don't get a flight tickets on Sabbath. And this is not some kind of Jewish halacha. This is what Jesus himself is teaching about what his disciples should or shouldn't do on Sabbath. And we have these examples. So, as you can see, the ethics of Sabbath is taught by Rabbi Jesus. So, and he goes the same direction as the Torah. Torah doesn't give you a whole list of things, do's and don'ts, but they give you, in the Torah, Moses gives examples. Cooking, lighting the fire, and so forth. So, yeah, they're reasonable requirements. But this is where the balance has to be. How do we balance between us saying, all these Sabbath restrictions are, especially Adventists love to talk about this, complaining about their parents, how their parents restricted them unfairly on Sabbath, and now we want to do what we want to do. And how do we balance it between this new neo-orthodoxy in Judaism, where you flip the switch, it's violation of Sabbath? I'm wondering what Jesus would do in that hotel, which I love, in Jerusalem, Rimonim Shalom. What would he do if he had to come to the elevator and see two elevators? One where you can press the buttons on Sabbath, and another where you don't press the buttons on Sabbath, and it stop, 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 stop. Which elevator would Jesus take? That's the question I am wondering about. And this is the way I always make my decisions about Sabbath. What would Jesus do? He's my rabbi. He teaches, he gives a very clear examples, and so we have to use them. All right, my dear, this is our Torah lesson for the past week. It's already uh, the beginning of the next week, and I wish you uh, Shavua Tov. Have a good week. May the Lord keep you in this uh, very unusual time. For some of you, it may be a trying time because we're thinking about our jobs and when will this end. But let's put our hope in the Lord, uh, and let us look at Jesus in these circumstances too. Heavenly Father, I pray that you would give us your presence of your love in this situation so that we would remain calm and that we would have all what we need. In your blessed holy name, amen.